Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening. Welcome to Power BI Dev Camp. Today's topic is the developer deep dive into row-level security. With us, as always, is our Dev Camp counselor, Ted Pattison. Good morning, Ted. How are you?
Hey, good morning, Daniel. How are you today?
Doing well, thanks. Why don't you tell us a little bit more about what today's session is all about?
Well, there's a very important security feature named row-level security in Power BI. So this is going to be a pretty fast-paced discussion of using that, from the ground up, but getting to pretty advanced scenarios, including some developer topics. Let's go ahead and start up with the session. First thing I want to remind you of is that we have a portal for Power BI Dev Camp. And you can get information about different sessions inside there. So for instance, if I take a second to navigate, out to the DevCamp portal, what you'll see is that, if you want to see videos of our past sessions, we have them in an easy way to kind of pull them up from YouTube. Also, if I look at our session for today, session 18, developer deep dive into row-level security, you'll also see that we have some links. So if you wanted the PowerPoint slides for this session that I'm going to present, they're here. If you click on demo files, it will take you to the GitHub repository. So as we go through this session, if you look at this repository, one thing that I'm going to do is go over a couple different PBIX solutions. So I've kind of put them inside here, as well as there's two development solutions that we're going to look at along the way. Okay, so what I wanted to do is just kind of cover the intro elements of make sure you understand the value of the Power BI Dev Camp portal, and if you want the demo files so you can recreate in demos what I'm going to be doing today, we've provided those for you as well. Okay, so what we're going to do is we're going to start with the basics. We're not going to dwell on the basics. We're going to get through them pretty quickly. But we're going to talk about row-level security, what are roles, how do we write rule filter expressions, and then we'll move into dynamic RLS. So as you get into RLS, you'll see that it makes a lot of sense to get more advanced and have a dynamic scheme, so that you're not hard coding values in your filters. Okay, also we're going to look at a couple advanced RLS design issues. And then at the end, this is, for developers using App-Owns data embedding, we're going to look at a couple cases. One is with App-Owns data embedding, where you're going to embed the roles, into an embed token. And then also at the very end, Power BI just got a new feature in December, and that is in an embed token, when you're using App-Owns data embedding, we now have a custom data field that we can put random data in. Well, I guess not random, but whatever you like to put inside there, and that can be used in your RS rule filtering. Okay, so that's the topics that we're going to look at today. Now, let's start at a high level. What is row-level security? So it's an authentication scheme. It's a scheme that determines that one user can see a certain set of data, and another user might see a different set. And the idea is that we're going to write filters for RLS roles. And the way that Power BI works, if you set up your filters correctly, it guarantees that users will only be able to see the data that they want to see. Now, each role is scoped within a data set. And you have to create roles within Power BI desktop projects. You create your data set in Power BI desktop, you add the roles, and then you are going to publish that data set to the service. And after that, you'll be able to map users and groups, to these roles. Now, a role is defined using DAX expressions. So let's get into a little bit more detail. So when you define a role, it's going to have 0 or more filters. Why not 1 or more? Well, sometimes it makes sense to define a role that has no filtering and therefore allows the user to see all the data. Now, if you have a role that has multiple filters, state equals Florida, year equals 2020, what's going to happen is that you're going to get the rules anded together. So you'll kind of see less. Each time you put another filter in, it's going to be more restrictive and take data away from the users that are in that role. However, it's also possible to put a user in 2 or more roles. So for instance, one role allowed you to see the sales in Florida, another role allows you to see the sales in Georgia. So if I put a user in two roles, all the data available for each role is ORed together, and you get the union of that. Okay, so just remember, multiple filters within a role, they're ANDed together, but once you have a user assigned to multiple roles, the restrictions are ORed together. Now, there's going to be two ways that you go, and if you have studied RLS and done Google searches to kind of find things out, you'll find that there's a lot of discussion around static RLS design versus dynamic RLS design. In simple cases, you might be able to use a static design that has multiple roles. That's the first thing we're going to look at in my demos. But as you get into common scenarios, static RLS designs don't scale. And so coming up with a dynamic RLS design, is going to allow you to do a lot more. And quite often when you create a dynamic RLS scheme, you don't have to create multiple roles. You'll create a single RLS role, and every user will map to that role. And the idea is the logic in that role can look at the user and figure out what type of data to show to that user. Now, with the best practice, design RLS so that users are added to a single role, while it's not a hard, fast rule. Once again, it's just a best practice, so try to design using dynamic RLS. And, one of your goals should be that each user gets added to a single role instead of multiple roles. Okay. Now, let's kind of start off. And so what I'm going to do is, let's go down and, remember that I pointed you to that particular GitHub repository. And inside there is a P/X folder, with the different files that we're going to be looking at. So if now we kind of go back to row level security and we open this up, let's kind of start with static RLS. So with static RLS, you're going to create RLS rules, and typically you're going to hard code things inside there. One thing I want to kind of call out here is you're using row level security. One of the things we care about is who the user is. So note that in this data model, I have a users table. If I look back here and we kind of look at this model, note that I just kind of created a users table, that's not really related to any of the tables, just so we can add a couple different measures inside there. And the idea is if I look at the users table, there is a username function. There is also a user principal name function. And the idea, and you can see that here I have, two different visuals that are displaying the username and user principal name. And you're going to see when you're in Power BI Desktop, it just kind of has the name of the user. So if I'm not in a domain joined machine, I'm not logged on with a domain account, it's just machine name / user. If I had logged on to, some company's domain, it might show me that, in the case of, user principal name, we'd have kind of the UPN as opposed to what we have here. And throughout my demos, I'm just going to be, showing, who the user is on the side. Now, when we get to roles, let's go to modeling. And the idea is we have a manage roles. And when I click on manage roles, it gives me a user interface to add the roles inside there. Now, what you'll see is that for each role, you have a set of tables listed on the left. And you're going to go to the tables and you're going to put in some type of a filtering expression. And you can see that each rule is specific to one table. And so you don't have to specify the table name, just a column name inside there. And the idea is I have, 3 different sales territories in this demo, one for the West Coast, one for the Central, one for the East Coast. And so let's go ahead and test the role out. So if I come up here and I say, I'd like to test out the Eastern role and choose OK, now it's going to show me, what the effect looks like. So testing in Power BI Desktop is pretty important, and kind of think about if I have this Eastern role, if I have a typo here, there's nothing that's going to tell me. It's just no rows are going to show up. So in this case right here, what we want to do is we want to kind of test as East. We've already done that. Let's go ahead and test, as the Central role. Great. And then finally, let's go ahead and view as, and let's test as the Western role. So it kind of looks like everything is working in my testing. And remember that it's possible to add users to multiple roles. So let's say that for this user, I add both to, Central and Western. And remember, when you get added to multiple roles, you can see all the roles of both rows combined or unioned together. And if I test that, we should see that works well. Okay, so let's say that we've kind of built this this data set. So remember that RLS is always about the underlying data set, not so much the report. If I publish this report and data set, and then I create 2 or 3 more reports, on top of the same data set, we only have one set of RLS rules, at the data set level. Now, let's go ahead and publish. So what we're going to do is we're going to go ahead and publish this report here. And we're publishing the data set as well. And, after we do that, let's go ahead and move back, into Power BI. We're going to go back to my workspace, where we have the demos here. And you can see this report, which is the static RLS. So here's the data set. Now, the next thing we're going to do is we're going to go to security right here. So the idea is that once you have role level security, you will have a security option. And when you go in there, you can basically start adding things to your RLS roles. Now, in this case right here, let's go back to the Azure Active Directory. And back in Azure Active Directory, one of the things that I've done here is I've created a couple different groups. And, the idea is that if I have a group, such as Eastern region, and then, I have a certain number of members, of that particular group. And then back in Power BI, it is possible for you, to add individual users to this. But a lot of companies instead, would rather just have RLS, assignments at the Azure AD group level. Okay, but it's your choice. So what you're able to do, is you're able to add, either groups, or users inside here. And, just to go ahead and do a test of this, let's go ahead and I'm going to say, new incognito window. Let's go to app.powerbi.com, and let's sign in as one of our typical users. So as we come inside here, this looks very new. So we have Jason B at and powerbidevcamp.net. Let's go ahead and once we're able to, get inside of this site, and let's see, finally we get inside here. Let's go to RLS demos. And as I hit RLS demos, this is what this user is going to see inside here. And let's go ahead and kind of open, this report as that particular user. And you can see, because I've only put that user, in one of those Azure AD groups for Eastern, this user is, only going to see, data from the Eastern territory. Okay, now let's go ahead and I'm going to move back to the slides. I'll close Task Manager. Hopefully I won't need this one again during this demo. But what you saw, is that when you want to manage roles, you're simply going to click on the Manage Roles, bring up the Manage Roles button. Also keep in mind that when RLS rules get enforced, everything changes. So there's a huge difference between a PBIX project that has 0 roles, where we say RLS, is disabled. And then once you add 1 role or more, all of a sudden, all the rules change. And you kind of saw how I went through and added the roles in there. But the idea is that if you have 1 or more roles and RLS is enabled, if a user tries to get to that report and is not in any roles, they will get a bad experience. The report will open, visuals will have the big X, saying you can't see any data. Now, what you also saw is that I used View As, and I was able to, quickly go through and, do my testing inside there before we publish. Okay. And then this slide kind of points out that, as you're working with RLS, let's go back to Power BI desktop here. Let's go back to our roles here. And, once I get back into model and we look at roles, I've added an admin role that has absolutely no filtering. So the idea is if you want someone to see all the data, there has to be a role with zero filtering involved there. So in many cases, you want to add that special role for a manager or some type of super user, that should have no limitations, on what they can see. Now, you also kind of saw that when you create RS rules, you can base your rules on equality. This field equals this value. And when you're creating RLS rules, that's what's preferred, is having tests for equality, especially when your RLS rules are going across, hundreds of thousands or millions of rows. Now, here's another common way. If I wanted to have a table filter expression with multiple states, I can say state in, and I can list out my states, and that's also considered equality. So it will be fast tests. And then you can also do something, with the DAX filter expression when you're looking at dates, and you want to specify some type of a date range. Now, it is possible to do filtering based on a text search, or, there's also a DAX function called path contains. And, here's an example where I want to look at a field and see if it contains a substring of Western. Yes, this will work, but I'm going to call out right here, beware, because this is one of the main issues of performance. And the idea is, can you use a text search? You're not going to say yes, but only on very small tables, without that many rows. So a little bit later in the session, we're going to see an example of wanting to use this, but having our design, to optimize the table we look at to have the smallest number of rows. Okay, now you also saw once I pushed the data set into the Power BI service, well, then it was important to configure the role mappings. And so you configure the role mappings, with either Azure AD user accounts or Azure AD security groups. I will call out that, Microsoft 365, AKA Office 365 groups cannot be added as a role. So it has to be a standard security group or an email-enabled security group. Also note that service principals cannot be added to RLS roles in Power BI. Back, when they architected Azure analysis services, there are cases where you have roles and you put service principals, but not here. In Power BI, and we're going to kind of see this toward the end, service principals, as long as they have enough permissions on the underlying workspace, are able just to take a string value and put it in an embed token. And that, is how things are going to work. But once again, service principals cannot be added to RLS roles. Okay, and we kind of saw how RLS enforcement works. Okay, so now one more gotcha. And that is, let's go back and we see our particular user. And this user is, looking at the data, and, things seem to be working fine there. But now let's go over to my account. And let's go back to our data set. Let's go to access. And, we've added users with all report consumers. Okay, so, let's take this one particular user, who is Jason B. Let's go ahead and we're going to add that user, Jason B. And we'll add that user as anything other than viewer to show this thing. So the idea is that if you are a contributor or a member or an admin of this workspace, let's go ahead and choose add. You now don't just have read-only capabilities on the data set, you have read-write capabilities. And so the effect there, let's go ahead and do a refresh. And what you're going to see is all of a sudden, you think this user is only seeing a set of the data, but because this user has been added to the workspace in a role other than visitor and has read-write, RLS is disabled. So the moral of the story, is make sure your users have read-only access, or RLS will not be, something that constrains what they can see. So if you are going to add users to a workspace, you have to add them as a visitor or RLS will not work. The other thing that, you might consider, is instead of having, users get access directly to the workspace here, let's go back to our workspace and let's go ahead and, publish this as an app. And if we publish that, as an app, then we get to specify, which particular users, can get in and see things inside. Okay. But once again, if you give a user permission to content through the app, it's always going to be read-only. And so you don't have to kind of worry about, how you've added them, to the data set or to the containing workspace, I mean. Okay, so now that we've seen that, let's go ahead and dive into, what I think is a very important topic, and that is working with dynamic row-level security designs. Now, what's the motivation for dynamic RLS? Well, let's say I'm using static RLS, like in my last demo right here. So if I go back to Power BI Desktop, and now we're going to say manage roles, and here I only had 3 roles because there's only 3 regions. What instead of regions, I wanted to go to states? Well, then I'd have 50 roles. What if I wanted to go to cities? I might have thousands of roles. What if I wanted to go to zip codes? So the idea is that static RLS doesn't scale if you have lots of different roles. There'd be too much ongoing, management to be adding roles and mapping users to roles. So generally what we like to do, is have some type of dynamic design, where, in the best scenario, you only have to create one role, you put all users in that role, and the logic of the role figures out, what data that user can see. So let's work through a common example. So in this case, let's move over to a second example. Okay, so with this one, what we're going to do is we're going to move to this wingtip sales dynamic RLS. And so the first thing to see is that when you use dynamic RLS, generally you're going to map the user to a specific set of data. So let's go back and look at this. So the first thing we do is we have a users table, but unlike my previous example, let's go look at the data. Here, when I look at the users table, I actually, had to find a way to import, the actual names of the users. And, what's important is that you have a user field. And the idea is that, when someone logs in and you look at the user with the username, you should be able to map them to a row in this table. Note here, if I want to test in Power BI Desktop, you're able to kind of put what your username, evaluates to in the desktop. Okay, now here, what we'll see is that in addition to the users table, now we're going to have another table that kind of serves as the user permissions table. And then there's a third table, and that's the thing that I want to add permissions to. So in this case right here, we're going to keep it simple, and we're going to look at sales regions. But the idea is that now I have a table where I can just add a record to basically give a user permission to a particular region. Now here, if I look at the regions table, there's just 3 regions, but this design would work equally well if we wanted to go to states or cities. And now let's look at the user permissions. And the idea with user permissions is that each row here, gives one user the ability to see one particular region. Okay. And in some cases, we might want to add, multiple rows in here so that a user has the ability to see, more than one thing. So let's go back here. And the other thing about this demo is that, to make this something it wouldn't be too hard to recreate, you need this metadata. And so I just put it into a simple Excel workbook, RLS demo metadata. Let's go ahead and open that up. And the idea is that you have to maintain this data somewhere. I'm maintaining it in an Excel file. You could maintain it in a SharePoint list. You could maintain it in a SQL database. It's kind of up to you, where you're going to maintain it. Okay, now the idea is that if we look at a user, here's this Ted P guy, and then we look at the permissions table, this user has the ability to see the Eastern region. So let's go back to Power BI desktop here. And now let's go ahead and just like we did before, we're going to go to View As, and now we're going to say Dynamic RLS Role. And the idea is that this is now going to percolate through, and because this user, only was mapped to the Eastern, they're just going to see Eastern. Now, if I come back here, let's go back here and, let's go ahead and put in Ted and Central Region, and I'll go ahead and save that. A neat little trick in Power BI Desktop is you don't have to do a full refresh. Instead, I can just refresh the user permissions table, refresh data, and what we should see there, is after this refresh works out, all of a sudden I've given this user, the ability to see more data inside. So the advantage of this, is we only have one particular role that we have to worry about. And it should scale, and we'll just might have to have, what's behind the scenes, be a little bit more complex. But you can see here, we have one role for all users, and all it does is it maps the current user to something in the users table. So if I go back to these slides right here, what you've seen here is that the simplicity of having a single role and all users mapped to that, is very scalable. In our case right here, we basically have a design that picks a particular user. And then there's this cascading propagation of filters, from the users table to the permissions table, to the thing that this should be the regions table, and then on. So the idea is it just kind of percolates the filtering down. Now, there's one important thing that we have to look at. First of all, a little bit of background. When we work with Power BI Desktop, and we look at our particular tables, we have these different relationships right here. So just as a quick review, we have one-to-many and many-to-one relationships, which are the most common, and those are the ones we like. We have one-to-one relationships, which aren't common. But then we also have the ability to support many-to-many relationships. So in a little bit, I'm going to call out, some of the problems that we have with many-to-many. But in general, what we want, is one-to-many. Now, what I want to do is I kind of want to point out that when we start at users, each user is going to be in one or more roles or have one or more permissions. So that is a one-to-many. But here you can see that we have permissions to region, and that is a many-to-one. So I'm going to open up this. And so step number one is note that if you have cross-filter direction set to single, it's only going to propagate the filtering from regions to user permissions, because when we're set to single, it only propagates from the one-to-many side, not back from the many-to-one side. So what we need to do is we need to set this to both. And the idea is I want the filtering on user permissions to propagate down to regions. And then also, we're going to click, if we have this being kind of a RLS filter propagation path, we're going to set apply filter in both directions. And that's how we get things set up. So what we'll see here is we generally start and we have a bunch of one-to-many relationships all the way down to the fact table, with kind of the exception of the permissions table where we might have to, have a many-to-one direction. And I've kind of shown you what we have to do is set it up with a cross filter equals both. Okay, so now we've seen that. Let's go back to the slides. We're going to come back to many in a second and talk a little bit more about them. But what you saw here is that in your filter propagation path, anytime you have the many-to-one, you have to set cross filter direction to both and apply security filtering in both directions. And, this works really well with small sets of data, but setting this, if you have 100,000 things that you're trying to set permissions on, this won't scale. But quite often the thing you're trying to set permissions on, is going to be a state, a region, a zip code, and hopefully that set of items, is, under, a few thousand or less. But what you might see is you might see performance issues, if the thing, in this case, the regions table, has, tens, hundreds, thousands, or millions of records. Okay, now you also saw me test. One thing I haven't shown that is here, I kind of showed you that, you can test, and you're just kind of testing, as in our case right here, I'm in as Dionysus Ted P. But let's say I wanted to test, as another user. So I can also click another user and then Jason B at Power. So this just kind of allows you kind of quickly to kind of test different users. And if I've got everything right here, I should be able to set that. And now I see, what does Jason Bourne see when he comes in here? He only sees East. And going back to our spreadsheet, once again, if I do a quick test right here, and now we put Jason B, and once we've got Jason B inside there, we'll add Jason to Central, and maybe we'll add Jason to Western, as well. Put this user in all those roles. And then, as I come back here, once again, all I got to do is go to the user permissions table and say refresh data. And I should see now I've kind of added this user to more roles inside there. Okay. Well, now we've kind of looked at both static and dynamic binding. The one thing you can't forget, though, is when you use dynamic RLS and you only have a single role, you still need to make sure that that role, has all the users mapped to it. So one thing that's very important, inside of this demo right here, let me get back over to the browser. Let me go to the RLS demo. Let's now go to our data set. And so let's go to security. And what you can see is that every user has to be mapped to the role. So quite often what we do is we get the Azure AD group that's going to contain everybody and put that inside there. So every single user, is mapped to this role, and realize that if a user isn't mapped to the role, your dynamic scheme, will not work. Okay. So now the next thing we're going to look at is a couple of advanced RLS design issues. First thing to understand is that there are certain types of relationships that don't work as well with RLS. So from a data modeling perspective, a relationship, basically is created between two different tables. And relationships are classified as regular or limited. So everything that we've been dealing with so far, is a regular relationship, one-to-many relationships or many-to-one. And the idea is that both tables are in the same site group. Okay, site group, that's a new term. What the heck do you mean by site group? If you have an imported model, all your tables are in what we call the same site group. If you're using direct query against a single SQL Server database, all the relationship between tables are in the same site group. But now we have this ability to create composite models. So I can have one model that has some imported data, some data from direct query to SQL Database 1, and other data from direct query connection to 2. And the idea is that it's possible to create relationships across these site groups, such as you have a model where you have some imported data and some direct query data, and then I try to create a relationship, between one of the imported tables and the table in direct query. That is what we call a limited relationship. Also, many-to-many relationships are considered limited. And the idea is that we don't get this guarantee of uniqueness on one side or the other. So two things happen. One is performance, is not as reliable, especially as the number of records get to be large. And also, when you have limited relationships, having RLS, work is not as reliable, because there are certain types of many-to-many relationships where there's different filtering paths that they could go down that would come up with different results. So in general, try to avoid many-to-many relationships and try to avoid relationships that go across site groups. So one problem is that with many-to-many, it could be really slow. A second problem is with many-to-many, you might not get the results that you're expecting. Once again, things are indeterminate with some many-to-many relationships. The other issue is when you have many-to-many relationships, or you have limited relationships based on cross-site group relationships, you'll find that if you try to add a user to 2 or more roles, it will complain and say that there's this known issue, where data might leak. So it's just going to fail and not let you do that. So if you have a many-to-many relationship, the recommendation is to go back to your queries and basically, create the relationship, such as, this inside here, where we have. So for instance, if you had some users table that had user permissions and you had many-to-many between the two, refactor it so that you only have one-to-many and many-to-one relationships going down, and then you're going to be in much better shape. Okay. Another thing to think about is, do you really need RLS? If you have data from a database and you have Department A and Department B, and everyone from Department A can see data and everyone from Department B can see their data, do you really need one data set that has that data? Can't you create 2 different data sets and put them in separate workspaces? And, in your query, you just have kind of the equivalent of the RLS rule. So by separating things, into different data sets, you might not need RLS at all, because people can only get to the data set that has the data, for them. There are other reasons. If RLS is optional, you'll get better performance without it. You might have smaller data sets. If you had 10 departments and you have one big data set, versus one data set per department, where it's going to be a lot smaller. So smaller data sets, better isolation. Also, there's certain scenarios like publish to web where RLS isn't supported. So having some design, where you have separate data sets, would be advisable there. The other thing is that you can measure the impact of RLS. So Adam and Patrick the guy in a cube fellas, have some great videos on doing performance testing with Performance Analyzer and DAX Studio. But the idea is turn off DAX or turn off RLS and run a query. Turn it on and run the same query. And what you're going to see is that RLS is always going to slow things up. But if it slows things up a little bit and you're getting the performance benefit, that's great. But we've also seen, lots of customers, have really clever RLS designs that do things like a string search, through 3 million records, and they wonder why it takes 2 minutes to open the report. So using different tools and kind of seeing the impact of RLS, is an important thing to do. Now, one more thing we want to see here is a partial RLS design. So let's say that we have this application, and let's go ahead and open. And this one is going to be Wingtip Sales partial RLS. So let's say that we're showing sales figures, to salespeople. And I want to show that each salesperson, what they've done. But I also want to show kind of a total to everything else. So here we have California, and we have about 5 million. And we look down here and the total's 29 million. So they're doing 18%. Now, what we want to do is we want to show the total even against rows that we can't see. So let's go ahead, and what I'm going to do here is let's go to modeling, let's go to view as, and let's say that I want to see the Eastern role inside here. Now, let's look at our first example. So if I wasn't using RLS and I wanted a percentage of sales, I'd basically say, let's look at sales revenue. Okay, and then let's look at all selected. So don't just look at California, but look at all the rows. But the problem here that you see, if I can get rid of this thing right here, is that this adds up to 100. I didn't want to see percentage within the small set. I wanted to see, percentage of the whole group. And, if they're taking rows away, not only will they take rows away that you can see directly, but they're taking rows that can be fed to the aggregation. So let's look at a solution for that. So here, what we'll do is we'll go back to our query. And so what we're going to do is we're going to have sales, and this is going to give me the fine detail, and it's going to point to customers and tells me what state. But then I'm also going to pull back total sales. So now this isn't giving me the detail of where the sales are coming from, but it just gives me a total number. And so, the big benefit here, let's go back over to this side right here, is that since I have total sales by day, and down here, we have the sales that are coming in, but realize, these rows from sales, we'll get more or less of them depending what role. Total sales is always going to give me the same answer inside here. Okay, so looking back here, what we can see, one more time, let's go ahead and, add our view as role and view as Eastern. And so note that this now shows, that we're 9% of all sales, including rows of sales that we can't see with RLS. So once again, you're going to having summary tables brought back so that you can do a, percent of total, gets to be a common issue, and that's the way that we solve it. Okay. Now, I think we've been through all the advanced parts. Two last sections, we're going to look at, developer issues. So in particular, let's say we're developing with Power BI embedding, and we're using app owns data embedding. So what you're going to see is that we're going to have to generate embed tokens. And so what I'm going to do is, let's move over here, and I'm going to move into some code here. And the idea is that we'd like to, get a report and put some RLS inside there. And so here's some code where I'm going to get, data about the report. But what I'm going to need to do is I'm going to call PBI client reports, and I want to generate an embed token. Now, when I generate the embed token, I want to do it with, a effective identity. When I create the effective identity, I have a username. I have one or more GUIDs for the data sets and what roles that they're in. So once again, your service principal behind your application, will be an admin or a member of a workspace. And it has to know what roles exist in that data set. But the idea is that when it creates an embed token, it's just going to add one or more roles inside there, and pass that back. So if we look at this example right here, I have users, and users are in different Active Directory groups. And so here, when a request comes through, I can just figure out, what groups this user is in. And another thing we might decide is whether the user should be able to bring the report into edit mode. Okay, so here I figure out who the user is, I get what roles the user is in, and then I'm simply going to call this and pass the roles. Okay, now you can see that, here's one way to create an embed token. Now, if we look at this right here, and I'm creating this embed token, the idea is if I figure out what roles that user is in, I'm simply going to add the roles, into the embed token that gets passed back. And the embed token will tell Power BI what the roles are. And those roles, will basically be used to decide what data to bring back for that user. Now, last thing we're going to look at here is one more example. And this one is going to be using custom data. Okay, so let me go ahead and stop this right here. And now we're going to move over to another demo. And so in this case right here, we're going to, be working with, maybe what I'll do for this demo is, let's go ahead and set a breakpoint here. And we'll go ahead and start this up. And let's also, use Fiddler right here. Okay, and so now if I start this up right here, and I can kind of step through the code that's going to create the embed token for us. Now, first thing to say is, you have to figure out who the username is and what role that user is going to be in. And so I'm kind of leaving this to your imagination how you're going to do that. So if you're doing app owns data embedding, you have to authenticate the user, so you should know who the user is. You also have to keep your own security metadata. So for this user, what role or what data should that user be able to see? So let's say that for this user, I've decided that we're going to use this role called states role, and we're going to go ahead and add what states that user can see. Okay, given that, let's now kind of call get report. And this takes us over to here. And now we can kind of step through this process of how we're going to build things out. Okay, so here we'll get our client, great. Here, I'm going to call to Power BI, get information, about my report. If we look back here, you can see that I just made this API call down here. And, one of the things that we generally need to get is the dataset ID, because the dataset ID is going to have to go, inside the embed token, which is why, given the fact that I had the report ID, but not the dataset ID, I have to make this call. Okay, so now we're going to use something that's a bit more complicated. And this is the new way to create embed tokens. Ultimately, we're going to call PBI client embed token generate token. But now I have to create this object, the token request. And the names are a little bit ugly, generate token request v2. But within the token request, I'm going to add the dataset ID. And if I wanted this token to have multiple datasets ID, I can add them in there. Likewise, we're going to add the GUIDs for the reports. If you add one for the target workspace, the GUID for a workspace, that would be so you could add new content. So for instance, if you wanted to do a save as on a report, it's creating a new report, that user is going to have the GUID for the workspace in their embed token. And now identities. So now we're going to add the username, we're going to add the data sets, and this time we're going to add custom data. Okay, so what we're going to do now is, let's take a couple more steps here. And so now we're going to actually create the embed token. So if I come back here and we make that call, what we should see, is that we just made a call, to get the embed token. And you can kind of see with my code, I'm specifying what the data set is. I have one or more identities. There's my custom data, that is inside the embed token. Note that recently we put the ability, when you're creating an embed token, to reduce the lifetime under 60 minutes. There, I'm just kind of showing you. So if you didn't know that, but now we can return this, back to the caller right here. And what you can see is they're in a states role, and I want to show them just a certain number of states. Okay, let's go back here. And so what I'm going to do at this point is let's open one more. Let's open this one, our wingtip sales RLS with custom data. Now, this idea of custom data, is going to be, is something that we didn't support until this past December. But the idea is that when you create an embed token, you can put custom data inside there. If I go back, here to Fiddler, what you can see that as we built this identity, there's my custom data string. Now, today you are limited to 256 characters, so don't get carried away at what you can do, but to put a small list of items, is going to work inside there. And the idea here, let's go back to Power BI Desktop. And now if we go ahead and we look at our roles inside here, I have a states role, and now I have state contains string. And so just like we have username, we have custom data. So as of last December, we can use custom data in Power BI. And the idea is that if it contains this string, let's go ahead and, see what happens here. I'm going to go back here, and to make them a little better, let's get rid of that breakpoint we set before. And now with that breakpoint gone, I have one user. And with this user, you can also see for my demo, I'm just kind of showing you what we're passing as custom data. We're just able to, add that user to a certain number of states. Likewise, with this user right here, Vermont, New Hampshire, Massachusetts, Rhode Island, I look at the third, so it just gives you kind of a simple way to kind of pass the states or a list of IDs, to the back end. Now, one of the things that I want to point out right here about this is that we're doing a string search, contain string. So immediately a flag should go up saying, I got to watch performance because that could get away from me. So if now you have a fact table that has 5 million rows, you have a customers table that has 375,000 rows, you don't want to use this type of filtering across one of those because it would absolutely kill you performance-wise. So here's this technique. Let's go back to Power BI desktop and this one particular project. And one of the things that you've seen, instead of just going to customers and going down all these rows, we split out, into a separate states table. If I look at the states table right here, you're going to see that there's only a state, one row for each state. And at most, you're going to have 50 rows inside there. And the idea is it's much better to start, the RLS here, because you only have to do a string search, across at most 50 rows. If I switch this over to here, you'd see that it would have a huge impact on performance. Okay. And if I kind of keep going with the demo, you can kind of see that, some of these have states role, but I also could, put extra, here's the regions role, where in this case, I want to match to, one or more regions. But basically, any column on a table, you'd be able to add in there, and get that. So with custom data, once again, let's kind of go back. And if we, look at our rule right here, manage roles, and we kind of look at that right here, so definitely, this can work. Just realize the performance implications. And if I wanted to do something like put it on a particular column, and that column has, is in a table with 100,000 rows, can I just split out another table, probably back in the query phase, that just lists the unique values that you can basically, walk through there as well. Okay, so hopefully that should give you some, ideas about, how to do things properly inside there. Okay, and so, at this point, we've kind of been through, many different topics. The last two were specifically for developers. So if you don't develop with C#, that might have been a little bit much for you. But hopefully that gives you kind of a good idea about row-level security. And hopefully some of the things that we've done, will be able to help you, as you create your own row-level security designs. So I'd like to thank everybody for attending today.
I'll also just do a quick call out now while we have a second for the YouTube playlist that has all the past DevCamp sessions. There's quite a few in there, so have a look and brush up on all your Power BI needs.
Well, hopefully we'll see you next month with Power BI Desktop, where the topic will be working with the Power BI admin APIs and how to administrate and enforce governance, in a Power BI environment. Thanks again. Good day, everybody.